As the senior person in your organization, no matter how big your organization is, people are looking up to you for answers, even when you don't have the answers. Consistency is really important. Saying the same thing over and over again and making sure people are hearing it and you're staying consistent with your word. And then also, right, I don't know is always a great answer to things when you really don't know.
In this episode, we speak with Hayes Humphreys, COO of Virginia-based Devil's Backbone Brewing Company. Hayes discusses the impact communication has had on his career and the successful craft beer business he leads. You're listening to CEO Voices, Leading with Communication, with your hosts, June West and Steve Soltis.
Hayes, first of all, congratulations. I've got to admit, I think you've got the coolest job probably in the entire world. Not only are you leading Devil's Backbone, an incredible portfolio of craft beers, but you're doing it right here in beautiful Central Virginia. So tell us a little bit, Hayes, about your journey from Darden to the this exciting, incredible world of craft brewing.
Sure. Thank you for the introduction. Yeah, I'll say that I haven't met a classmate of mine that doesn't think I made the right decision by sticking around and working for Devil's Backbone. Although when we started in 2011, it was a riskier decision. But yeah, my short history is that of a guy from Brooklyn who has pursued things that seem like interesting options at the time and sort of let my passions take me where I wanted to go. So I remember specifically writing all of my essays to get into Darden about getting into renewable energy and all these things I thought I wanted to do. And then I got here, and a few months into school, a friend looked at me in class and said, like, "Hey, do you want to start a brewery?" And I mean, it was this eye-opening moment. I liken it to like a movie, an 80s movie montage where just like I had this cascading set of images and a realization that I had never considered that as a real thing that people could do. I just thought of beer as something that sort of was at the bar and it sort of sold itself. And, you know, how much work and know-how did it take to sell something that people really loved? And so then I started poking around, and, you know, back in 2009, 2010, when I was at Darden, the craft beer industry was in a real transitional moment. In fact, I very specifically remember going to the grocery store, going down to Harris Teeter at Barracks Row in late 2009 and looking at the beer shelf and seeing all these craft brands, and they were very, I would say, immature. The industry was immature at that time, and looking at it and saying, hey, actually, I think I can make a difference. So it was a really fun time to get in. Virginia was a few years behind, I think, the kind of leaders in the country out on the West Coast, but really exciting time to jump in. We hit our timing right and got to kind of ride this evolution of craft beer and also help shape it, especially on the local level. And what it, you know, for perspective, when I started in the brewing industry in 2011, there were 1,500 breweries in the country, and we now have over 10,000 10 years later. So the amount of competition and the types of competitors have exploded.
When I go to the Harris Teeter at Barracks Road to buy beer for my son when he's coming over to the house, I have no idea what to buy because there's so much there. So I kind of buy Devil's Backbone, of course, because it's the local iconic brand. But how do you and how did you and your partner back in 2011 make your beer stand out in this transitional industry, make it different? What's your brand essence, my marketing colleagues would say?
So my first interaction with Devil's Backbone was actually doing sort of a consumer listening project on what was it that our staff and our consumers loved about the brand, about coming to Devil's Backbone, and then how do we distill that into visual brand identity, into marketing, into sales effort, that sort of thing. So from the very start, that's been my biggest concern, is how do we present ourselves to the world? And that's definitely evolved. I think the result of that project has provided sort of the backbone that has propelled us or sort of guided us throughout the intellectual guardrails, I guess. We talked to folks and we came up with the brand mantra that was sort of centered around rustic, community, and being genuine, right? Those were the three things that surfaced over and over and over again. And so we've always tried to build around that, right? We have a beautiful location in Nelson County. It's where people come and they fall in love with the brand. They fall in love with the brand both because they can, they love the beer and they love the experience of being there, but also because it's typically associated with some of their best days outside. They've either come off the Thai River kayaking, or they've been hiking Three Ridges, or they've been skiing at Wintergreen. And so there's all these really wonderful outdoor resources that we're able to take advantage of. And so we've always wanted to capture that in our outgoing messaging and make sure that a big part of our brand is protecting that. And so we spend a lot of time talking about drinking beers outdoors and protecting the outdoors. Our biggest partners from a charitable standpoint are the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, the Appalachian Trail Conservancy.
And I noticed you guys also recently appointed a chief hiking officer, which I think is super cool and quite frankly, super on brand for you guys. Could you talk a little bit about sort of that rationale and what you're learning in the brand influencer and social media spaces around that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the chief hiking officer was something we had been dreaming of doing for a long time. The Appalachian Trail is one of the last sort of great adventures. You have to leave your world and go into the woods for 6 months to do it. And that's really cool. And as we host over 1,000 Appalachian Trail through hikers at our base camp location every year, and talking to them is, talking about the transformations they're going through is really inspiring. So we wanted to be able to share that experience and those stories with the world. So we hired this chief hiking officer for the summer and had her go around and hike sort of lesser known trails that were accessible to people and encourage people to get outside and, and teach them how to do it if they don't know how to do it. So being able to have people get on the internet and search for this content and come to the Devil's Backbone Brewery website because they want to figure out how to be a better outdoorsman, that is bringing in a new stream of traffic, and it's building legitimacy for us in our brand. I think the same is true when you start talking about influencers and sort of digital marketing. We do a lot of that. My marketing director would laugh because I'm a little bit old school and that it still frustrates me that influencer is a job, but it is real. And so like I look at one of the cohort brands we have here at Anheuser-Busch who's been really good at this, but Babe Wine spends a ton of time vetting who their influencer is going to be. And some of their influencers only have 500 or 800 followers on Instagram, but the followers are the exact target consumer that they want, right? And so committing the time and energy to try to distill down to that micro level, who's really following this person? If you're getting, 100,000 eyeballs, but 99,000 of them don't want to do the thing that your brand is all about, then it's kind of a waste of money. And so that's been kind of the biggest learning for us as we do more and more of it, is like, how do we get really smart about who we're actually partnering with on an influencer standpoint, rather than just trying to find the biggest influencer that we can afford, basically.
That's great. You mentioned, Hayes, a couple of times tribes and tribalism, and you have obviously customers that are part of your tribe, but you also have an internal tribe. I'm imagining you're spending a lot of time communicating up to the mothership, Anheuser-Busch, and maybe you could talk a little bit about how that acquisition came about. But you've got to talk to them, and then you've also got to, talk across your organization, and you're that conduit between, the culture and the mothership. Can you expand a little bit about how you go about doing that, the nuances, some of the challenges associated with that?
Yeah, well, we're 5 years into our partnership with Anheuser-Busch, and I feel like I'm finally maybe getting a little bit smarter about it. It's taken, it's been a challenge for sure. And I will say that, to their credit, Anheuser-Busch has been everything that they promised they would be, which has been largely hands-off. They've been supportive of what our brand wants to do, and recognize that, they, as a very large company, have a hard time connecting with people in the same way that we do. And so they let us lead, which is really, really cool, right? The founders of the company are all still involved. The founders of all the other craft breweries in our cohort are still involved. So that is a lot of my job, which is that sort of peacemaker between the two. And you described it as a conduit, and it really is, right? A lot of what I do from an internal communication standpoint, now that I've gotten better at it and understand how this all works, is, I am that interface, and it is my job to explain to my family at Devil's Backbone, 210 folks, why it makes sense for us to do something that we maybe haven't done before, based on our values and why it still works for Devil's Backbone, but also what it's going to get us in terms of the bigger picture with Anheuser-Busch, right? And how maybe getting, doing things in an unexpected way is going to get us to the goal that we wanted all along, right? And so there's literally different vocabularies between the two companies. And so being able to sort of translate and speak both languages, there's definitely different sets of goals. There's different ways of rewarding and recognizing people. And so being able to, translate to people and help them understand why we're doing what we're doing, or help them understand when they're being, rewarded. Maybe they don't recognize it. And so we have to sort of talk through that. And so it's a pretty constant effort, and it's important.
Hayes, I must say you've made this communication professor very happy today, as you talked about the importance, as you see now, of communication internally. And for our Darden students and for our Darden communication classes, can you talk a little bit about your transformation from being an accountant to now a leading communicator in your company? And so what would you characterize your communication philosophy?
I think the thing that I have learned over the last few years is that stories are really effective. And anytime you are giving a presentation at any level, really, but certainly at my level, one of the most effective ways to help bring people along with you is to tell them a story, right? And understand the fundamentals of the economic point or the business point that you're trying to make deeply enough that you can translate it into pretty simple, layperson's terms, essentially. So it's been very effective for us internally as we've been trying to communicate to the bigger company what some of the challenges are for Devil's Backbone, right? We almost treat it like a television series, right? And every time I'm giving, especially like strategic planning presentations, the first little bit of it, no matter how short the presentation is going to be, is always going to be an on the last episode, right? Is going to be a recap of like what we agreed was going on before, what this next chapter, what this next episode is going to tell you about us solving the problem. And then, probably leave it on a cliffhanger so that they tune into the next episode. And so the most effective presentations I've seen and the most effective presentations I've given are the one that really walk the audience up to what the challenge in front of us is, gets their buy-in and agreement on what that challenge is, and then proposes solutions. And that works in entrepreneurial startup pitches. It works when I'm communicating what the Devil's Backbone plan is to Anheuser-Busch. And increasingly, something I took for granted for a long time is it's necessary as I talk to our group of 200 employees at Devil's Backbone.
Hayes, you mentioned challenges. I want to pick up on that for a second because the last 2 years have been obviously just ripe full of challenges. So I'm just curious as to from a communication standpoint, what have been the biggest lessons that you've garnered over the past 2 years in communicating to all these various stakeholder groups?
Lots of challenges during COVID operating a restaurant. We were lucky to have 90 acres of outdoor space that we could expand into. And I think there's a lot of stuff from an operational standpoint that will stick around. Yeah, I heard frequently the pandemic didn't introduce anything new. It just accelerated a lot of trends. And I think I've found that to be true. But specifically from a communication standpoint, I think, a couple of things that I learned that I would share with any other leaders that ever find themselves in a situation like this. And I think anyone who's leading an organization would be familiar with this phenomenon. But like, as the senior person in your organization, no matter how big your organization is, people are looking up to you for answers, even when you don't have the answers, right? So the COVID-19 pandemic was ripe with that, where suddenly I'm positioned as a virologist who needs to explain to everybody at the company kind of like what's going to happen, right? And especially in the height of things in the early days, May, June, July, when people were extremely afraid and none of us had any idea sort of how the virus worked and what was safe to do and what wasn't safe to do. You're being asked to answer questions you don't necessarily know the answer to. So what I took away from that is, consistency is really important. Saying the same thing over and over again and making sure people are hearing it and you're staying consistent to your word. And then also, right, I don't know is always a great answer to things when you really don't know. I think the other thing that's been really interesting from a communication standpoint is, the Zoom phenomena, right? I mean, we're sitting here on Zoom now, and Zoom is a big punching bag. People are pretty zoomed out at this point. But if you think of what Zoom has replaced, it replaced conference calls, which were pretty terrible for the most part. There was always folks in a conference room and you couldn't hear all the people. And then there were folks calling in on the phone call and you couldn't see anything. So if you weren't the person in the conference room, you couldn't see the content, right? And Zoom has solved a lot of those problems. So as a conference call, the Zoom meeting, I think, is really superior. But we've gone too far with the tool in a lot of ways. And I think that's going to be one of the challenges coming out of this. There's a lot of stuff we've stopped doing that I think is really valuable. It's really cliche to talk about the value of a phone call, but phone calls are great. And spontaneous meetings are great. And poking your head over your desk to see if somebody else is busy right now or can you go bother them is great. A lot of good things happen. And so that's something we're going to have to figure out coming out of this.
CEO Voices examines the communication that enables transformational leadership. June West is Associate Professor of Business Administration and co-founder of the Darden Leadership Communication Council, along with her colleague, Steve Soltis. Soltis is the former head of executive communication at the Coca-Cola Company and lectures at Darden. This podcast is a production of the University of Virginia Darden School of Business.